Good evening. Not sure if anyone's here yet, so yeah, just wait a while and hopefully some people will show up shortly. I don't know why I'm typing to you. I can talk to you, can't I? Good evening, W. Boomans. I think you're the first one here. I always feel a little bit awkward when these things start as to, when to actually start talking about things or how long to wait. But anyway, yes, hopefully there's some few people that were queued up to come on when the show starts. So hopefully they will tune in. Yes, it has been a while. I took a break over Christmas and New Year, and various things going on, family things going on, and that, and thought it'd be a good time to get it going in. Can't hear me? Is that just you, Aramis? That's Jeremy, isn't it? If I remember rightly. Is it just you that can't hear me? Hopefully, others can hear me. This seems to be suggesting I can hear me, and I could hear myself when I accidentally turned my volume up just now, so possibly it's just you, Jeremy. But yeah, took a break over Christmas and New Year. Hope everybody had a good time over the holidays. Yeah, just lots of family stuff going on, and it never quite seemed the right time to start again. So, but yes, I thought with the things that happen with Ethereum Classic, I've always been sort of searching for topics to talk about on the show, and there was one particular key point about double spending and about XRP that kind of struck me as being quite interesting and maybe something that people didn't quite know. So that's why I thought I'd bring it up in this show. Great. Oh, so you got your sound now, Jeremy. That's good. David D, hello. Beat Areno, is that Beat Areno? Good. Glad you can hear me too. So yeah, good to see people here on the show. So yeah, I guess I'll get started, and we'll see. Hopefully, some more people will join in as we go along. So what did I want to talk about today? I'm going to talk about double spend attacks. First of all, I'm going to talk about one of the key issues that cryptocurrency solved, which was a thing called the double spend problem, and talk about how it solved it, and then talk about some of the weaknesses, potential weaknesses, and issues that have been occurring. So, Beaterino says some people said it was a white hat hacker and they gave all the money back. It wasn't just Gate.io. No, Coinbase, I think. It was Coinbase that reported it for the Ethereum Classic ETC one. It was Coinbase, as far as I'm aware. And well, I've got their blog post up that I'm going to show in this talk. So let's sort of rewind a bit and let's kind of set the scene to kind of see what it is that the problem is that's trying to be solved, and then see what the vulnerability was. So the initial thing with cryptocurrencies, the big thing that Bitcoin first solved when Bitcoin came onto the scene, was a problem called the double spend problem. Now, if I have a physical coin or note, looking for a prop here, I don't have one. If I had a physical coin or a note and I give that to you, I no longer have that item. If I give you a piece of gold or a rock or whatever it might be that's our currency, if I give it to you, I no longer have it. So I can't spend it twice. I can't give it once to one person and then give that same rock to somebody else, because when I've given it to the first person, I no longer possess that rock. That rock, lump of metal, piece of paper with the Queen's head on it, coin, whatever it might be, whatever that token is that represents currency, I have given it to somebody, I no longer have it. Now, the problem in a digital world is that if I give you some digital representation of cash, then there's nothing stopping me giving that digital representation to something else, because it's just ones and zeros. It's bits and bytes. They can be copied. In the same way that if I send you a copy of a document, you know, I still have access to that document. If I send you a photo, I still have access to that photo. I haven't removed myself from owning it by giving it to you. And digital information is easy to copy. That was the whole issue around piracy with films and music, was that it's so easy to copy, much easier to copy digital representation than it was a vinyl LP or a cassette tape or a CD that you had to actually replicate some physical medium. Now, the way that most banks and credit card companies, you know, solve the problem is if you have a credit card and you go in and you pay for something in one shop, at the point of sale, when you put your card into the machine and type in your PIN or sign or whatever it is you need to do, it contacts your bank and says, does Matt have this money? And the bank goes, yes, allow him to spend it. So it goes, okay, well, I'm deducting £20, €20, $20, whatever it might be, from his account. If I now go into another shop and try and spend that, my balance will be £20 less. So if I only had £20 in my account and I spent that £20 and I'm now down to zero, I can't spend it again. Now that's only possible because there's one truth. There's one true canonical source of what is Matt's balance, and that's the bank. Now the problem with that is that is a centralized point. It's a single point of failure. If that bank goes bust, it disappears. If the government decides to stop me having access to my bank account, I can't get my money. There's a whole series of reasons why that has some problems. So what Bitcoin was the first digital currency to do was to solve the double spend problem without needing a central authority. So again, the problem is, how do I give some money, say 1 Bitcoin, to Alice, and then make it such that I can't give that same 1 Bitcoin to Bob? Right? If I give it to Alice, I can no longer spend that same 1 Bitcoin again. So how do we solve that? Bitcoin was the first one, and the way in which it did it is with a system called proof of work. And I'm simplifying a lot here, but this bit is just kind of to recap the general concept. The idea is that there's effectively a competition, a race in which a whole bunch of computers around the world, a whole bunch of nodes, try and solve a problem. And these computers are called miners. Now think of it a bit like solving something like a Sudoku puzzle, you know, the puzzle with the numbers, and you've got to add the numbers up and get them right. They're quite difficult to solve, and you can make them bigger and bigger and bigger, which makes them harder and harder and harder to solve. They're quite difficult to solve, but they're very easy to check that you've got them correct. If you give me a Sudoku, I can go through, add up the numbers, go, yep, that's right, yep, that's right, yeah, that's right, very quickly, compared to how long it might have taken you to actually solve that puzzle. That miners have that same sort of problem, and they have a problem that is very difficult to solve, but very easy to verify. And they all race to try and solve this problem, and the difficulty level is set, so effectively the size of the Sudoku puzzle is set, that it will be solved on average once every 10 minutes. And whoever solves that first announces it, says, I've solved it, and they effectively then get to choose which transactions go into the next block. So they're the ones that will say, Matt sent this money to Alice, and so it's recorded as that, such that if I then try and make a later transaction and send that same thing to Bob, I can't then send that again. Right? So that's how Bitcoin solved it, with its thing called proof of work. Now, one of the aspects of proof of work is that you have a blockchain, and a blockchain is a series of transactions grouped, and each one has the signature of the previous block, such that you can't alter one of the blocks without altering the signature, and that will then invalidate all the subsequent blocks in the chain. In the same way, if you have a metal chain and you break one of the links, you've broken that chain. and that's true with both. That data structure is there in Bitcoin. It's also there in XRP. It's there in most other blockchain digital ledger systems. So what happens is, at different points around the network at any one time, there could be two people that see the same transaction or see two different transactions. So I go and submit a transaction on one side of the internet, effectively, that says I'm spending this transaction to Alice, and on the other side of the internet I say I'm giving that one Bitcoin to Bob. So there's two versions of the truth there. One in which I sent it to Alice and one in which I sent it to Bob. And how do they get reconciled? And so what happens is each of the miners build the blockchain by adding another block to the chain. And at some point in time you might diverge, have what's called a fork in the network. And this happens regularly on Bitcoin. It's part of the design of how Bitcoin works. You have these what are called soft forks. These are different from what are known as hard forks, which give you the incompatible versions. So give you things like Bitcoin Cash versus Bitcoin SV versus Bitcoin ABC. But the network can fork. And what happens is you then effectively have a race on the two different forks of miners adding blocks, because one of the rules in Bitcoin is that the longest chain is the winner. And what will eventually happen is everybody will see all of the chains. So they'll all get broadcast around the network. So eventually they'll all be seen. And when you see a chain that's longer than yours, you discard your work and you go, okay, that's the true version. Hopefully I've managed to keep everybody with me there on that. Okay, so you have these blocks. You keep adding to the blocks, and whichever chain becomes the longest, so when you have a split, whichever chain grows the fastest is the one that is the truth. And then the shorter one will then discard, and the miners will adopt the longer one and continue building upon that, right? So that's all well and good. However, because there's this thing that there's a rule that the longest chain always wins, and you don't know whether you've seen the longest chain or not. At any point in time, suddenly another chain can become visible to you that is much longer than the one you've currently got, and the rule is that you've got to accept it. Right? That's the for want of a better word, a truer version of the truth. That is a more accepted version of the truth, the longest chain, than the one you have. So how can this be attacked? What can cause this, what's called double spend attack? So what happens is I, in secret, in effect, start mining a second chain. Now, in order for that chain to grow longer than the other chains, I've got to have more, what's called hash power, more ability to solve these puzzles than anybody else. So I've got to have at least 51% of the hash power, because I've got to be faster than the rest of the network combined. That's where this term 51% attack comes from in proof of work coins. So I need to have 51% of the hash power, and in doing so, that means I can build a chain longer and faster than the rest of the network and the rest of the miners combined. So I start building this chain in private. I don't announce it to the network. And there's a number of blocks I start building on there. And because I have more hash power than anybody else, this chain's going to grow faster than any of the other chains. Meanwhile, whilst I have that private one that I'm mining, on the public chain that people do know, I go and make a transaction with Bitcoin, say. So I go and deposit a bunch of Bitcoin at an exchange. That exchange sees that transaction and says, okay, Matt's got that. 1 Bitcoin is on the exchange. I could then do something like spend that. I could change it to another currency, so I could use that to buy XRP, say, and then spend it. Or, I could go and use it to buy something. Say I use it to buy, whatever, a car or whatever it might be. I spend that Bitcoin. I've still got my private chain. Now, in that private chain, I don't include the transactions that I spent on the public chain. So I don't include in them the fact that I bought this car or that I deposited 1 Bitcoin on an exchange. So what happens is that eventually I then make that private chain public, all of the other nodes see it, and it then becomes the version of truth. But that version doesn't have the transactions that I made. So they vanish effectively. I never made them. So I can make them again. I can spend that money again. I can double spend. So although I've spent that money once, according to the car dealership or the exchange or wherever it was I spent that Bitcoin, I bring out a new version of the truth that is more accepted because it is a longer blockchain than the public one, and everybody has to adopt it. That is the rule. So they will all adopt it, and in doing so they will adopt the version of the truth that omits the transactions that I previously made. So according to that then, I never made those transactions. I never bought that car, but it sat on my driveway. But I never spent that Bitcoin to buy that car. I never deposited that Bitcoin in exchange, but I've already converted it to XRP or Monero or whatever, and it's off somewhere else in the internet now, right? So that's all that's disappeared now. So that's how a double spend attack occurs. So just looking back at the chat here. Sorry, I was in the middle of that, so I wanted to kind of finish that before getting back to the chat again. Rob, good to see you again. Rob Lee, fantastic. JDF, hi. Tom Costner, hello. What's the difference between proof of stake and Ripple consensus? Tom asks. I'll cover that later, and we'll get onto that. And talk a little bit more about that. I can't say I know a huge amount about proof of stake, but I will, describe the general concept of it. So W. Borman's asked, what if you don't hold to these rules? Say I could buy my own version of mining software and make it easier to mine. Well, you can't just make it easier to mine, because remember I said that the challenge they're trying to solve, the puzzle they're solving, a bit like say a Sudoku, is difficult to solve but easy to verify. Now, when you broadcast your chain to the network, it will be able to check everything, and it will be able to tell whether you've cheated, because it'll look in there and go, no, that doesn't add up. We've said we need a Sudoku that is 100 squares wide, and you've submitted one that's only 50 squares wide. So that's not valid. So everybody will check that, and your chain won't be accepted if it doesn't follow the rules. So it has to be valid. It has to follow the rules. It has to have the solved checksum, the solved hash in the block. And if it doesn't have that, it won't be accepted. So what my goal is when I'm mining my private chain is for it to be a valid chain. I have to follow all the rules myself, but I'm just doing it in private and doing it faster than anybody else, and then I come around and release it. So, and Tom says this all sounds very difficult and or expensive. Yes, it is, and that is why it is difficult to do, and that is why Bitcoin is deemed to be secure as a result, because the only way you could do this is to get 51% of the hash power. And it was originally envisaged that it would be very difficult for any one entity to get 51% of the hash power, because it's distributed amongst computers all around the world. However, as we know, with the advent of ASICs, which are the dedicated hardware, these hardware miners, companies like Bitmain that make these hardware miners. I've got one somewhere. I'm not sure where I've put it. I've got a hardware mining device here. They can do things so much faster that what you've ended up doing is centralizing a lot of that hash power in places where it is cheap to procure electricity. So a lot of it is in China or in places like Iceland, where they have cheap geothermal electricity, for example. So the idea originally was it'd be really difficult for anybody to get more than 50%. The reality is that's getting closer and closer. So, and with Bitcoin, it'd be very difficult because there are so many people mining Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is to most extents deemed secure because there's nobody that would get that much hash power. So what happened with Ethereum Classic? So Ethereum Classic was a fork of Ethereum from a while back. There was a bug in Ethereum, and as a result of trying to fix that bug, Ethereum forked into two versions. So Ethereum, ETH, that a lot of us know, is the version in which they effectively rolled back the bug and said, okay, let's fix it and let's go forward. Ethereum Classic was a version in which a bunch of purists said, no, we're not going to fix it, we should just roll with it. It was a bug that happened, we're going to keep it as part of our history and go forward. So Ethereum Classic, which is much smaller cryptocurrency than Ethereum in terms of the number of users and the amount of hash power, Ethereum Classic was supported by several exchanges, including Coinbase. And what happened was somebody did one of these double spend attacks using Ethereum Classic on Coinbase. So here we go. Here's Coinbase's blog, and they talk about this deep chain reorganization. The way it's called a deep chain reorganization. When I said that you have these chains and they fork and they come back, that's called a reorganization, or a reorg for short. And like I said, this is perfectly normal to happen with sort of one or two blocks, but a deep chain where it gets to a number of blocks further than that, 4, 5, 6, 7 blocks, that's much rarer, because for each block further, you've got to have maintained that 51% hash power, which, as Tom has said, could be quite an expensive operation. However, these people here managed to get about $1.1 million worth of Ethereum Classic, and it doesn't cost $1.1 million to do a 51% hash attack on Ethereum Classic. In fact, I think if I've got it here. No, which one is it? I had here. There was there's a site that had a list of how much. Right. So looking at different cryptocurrencies, how much would it cost to run a 51% attack on them? And so Ethereum Classic, which is the one we're talking about here, it would actually cost just over $4,000 an hour. Now, you might, if you've used Bitcoin or Ethereum before and you've deposited on an exchange, you'll see that it has to have a certain number of confirmations before they accept it. Now, the reason for that being is that for each one of those confirmations is another block built on the chain. And the idea being is that the longer the chain goes from when I did the deposit, the harder and more expensive it is to do a reorg in which that could be invalidated, because we've done a lot more work since then. It's kind of like, if I bury something in the ground, over time, layers and layers of soil will build up, and over time it becomes harder and harder to get that original item out because more and more has been built upon it. It's kind of a bit like that. So with the hash power, you get these additional blocks that are built on it, and the longer that becomes, the less likely it is that you could invalidate that initial transaction. And for Bitcoin, it's normally accepted to be 6 blocks, and each block is 10 minutes. That's why it takes an hour. When you deposit something to an exchange, it takes an hour for them to accept it and say you actually have that. You actually have that money, right? That's why it takes an hour. So although Bitcoin transactions in theory are fairly instant and a new block is produced every 10 minutes, it takes an hour in reality, because they want to wait a certain amount of time to make sure there's effectively no, in the traditional world we call it a chargeback. You want to wait a certain amount of time to ensure that transaction is really immutable and nothing else is going to change it. But as we saw with Ethereum Classic here, it costs $4,000 to run a 1-hour attack. Well, if you need 1 hour's worth of confirmations, then that could cost you $4,000 to run that attack for 1 hour, and you come away with it with $1 million. That's a pretty good return on investment, if you ask me. You know, if you're a criminal, you spend $4,000 outlay and you come away with $1 million. You can see there's a certain attractiveness to that. Not that I'm advocating anybody do it, but obviously there's certainly a temptation there if that's what's involved. Now, those numbers might not be exactly correct, but you know, you get an idea of the order of the magnitude. While some things are expensive, you can actually make come away with a fair bit of money from them. So now, why did this happen on Ethereum Classic? So this is the thing. So a lot of the different proof of work coins use a different hashing algorithm, so a different puzzle. So one uses Sudokus, one uses crosswords, right? Example, analogy. They use a different type of puzzle. Now, if you have a hash algorithm on one, so here it mentions the algorithm here. Now, the reason for that being is that, for example, with Ethereum Classic, they use this hash algorithm called ETHhash. That's also the hash algorithm used by Ethereum. So Ethereum has a much higher total hash rate, 171 terahashes per second, versus Ethereum Classic, which is 8. So if you needed 50% of 8 terahashes, that's 4 terahashes per second. So 4 terahashes out of 171, it would be quite easy to redirect just a small proportion of the miners mining Ethereum towards Ethereum Classic. Now, the reason why I say Bitcoin is kind of safe at the moment is because 44,000 petahashes. There's and each of these mining algorithms has a different rate, so you can't directly compare, say, SHA-256 to ETHhash in terms of its speed. But what you can see is that Bitcoin has the highest hash rate of its hashing algorithm, SHA-256. So you couldn't just get another bigger coin that has more hash power behind it and redirect some of it towards Bitcoin, because Bitcoin's the biggest fish in the pond, right? So that's the thing that makes it safe. For now, obviously that could change, and it could be that more efficient mining operations happen. It could be that the economics change. At the moment, you've probably seen stories of Bitcoin mining operators in China throwing equipment out into the streets because it's just not economically viable. The price of Bitcoin has dived now so much that it's no longer economical for them to spend to buy the electricity to run the mining equipment to generate the hashes to get the reward for the Bitcoin that they're then selling. So it's no longer economical for them to run their operations. So they might be throwing all that equipment out. Well, where does it go? What happens if someone amasses all of that equipment for pennies on the dollar, stockpiles it and waits down the line until everything's sort of died down a bit and then mounts an attack? Again, very unlikely, but it could potentially happen. So, one of the things that kind of struck me about all of this is that XRP uses a different mechanism. It doesn't use proof of work. It uses a system called consensus. And the idea is, rather than having this competition to find one winner, and that winner is basically king for 10 minutes and they get to decide what goes in each block, with XRP and the XRP ledger, it's a cooperative process. So what happens is a candidate set of transactions is put up for voting, and a number of nodes effectively vote and ratify that, yes, that is the set of transactions. And in doing so, they then solve the double spend problem that way. So what they do is they validate the order in which the transactions happen in. So if I try and spend 100 XRP to Alice and try to spend that same 100 XRP to Bob, you will see both those transactions show up in one of the ledgers in the XRP ledger, but it will have ordered them in a particular way such that everybody agrees the transaction to Alice came first, then the transaction to Bob. And because we then know that order, we can then say, well, if he spent all his money giving it to Alice, then he's got nothing left to give to Bob. As long as we agree the order, and it doesn't matter whether the order is Bob first then Alice or Alice first then Bob. It actually doesn't matter which way around it is. It doesn't matter what the order is. It just has to be consistent such that everybody agrees this is the order things happen in. Because that way I can't spend that money twice, because everybody will agree that if I spent it on Alice, I can't then spend the same on Bob. Right? And the only person that I would inconvenience would be myself by trying to do it, because it would get rejected. So that's the system that XRP uses. So if you're an exchange and you're accepting XRP deposits, the chances are you will run your own node on the XRP ledger. So for your own safety, security, peace of mind, you will run, as an exchange, your own node that connects to the XRP ledger. And that's a bit of software, RippleD, that is involved with submitting transactions to the network, seeing what goes on the network. But each node in the XRP network knows what the rules are, and each node will apply the transactions it sees with respect to those rules. So every single node, there's over 1,000 of them on the network at the moment, every single node will validate every single transaction. And if it doesn't fit its rules, then it will discard it. So what that means is that as an exchange, when you receive an incoming deposit to the exchange of XRP, so if I deposit 100 XRP to Bitstamp, say, their node will see that transaction and check that it fits its rules and then accept it. So even if, for whatever reason, the rest of the rules of the network change, somehow, maliciously or deliberately or whatever, it doesn't matter, because Bitstamp will only confirm that the rules are correct as far as it's concerned. And so it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks, Bitstamp know that this transaction has to conform to those rules. And if it doesn't, it will reject it. Just outright. So it won't, Bitstamp won't receive that 100 XRP transaction if it doesn't conform to the rules. And with XRP, there's no reorgs on the chain. There's no rule that says you have to accept a longer chain with which is a more accepted version of the truth. The reason being is that you don't have that forking behavior in XRP, because you have this consensus protocol that agrees what the transactions are for everybody. So you don't have this process of multiple chains and then a longer one taking over and then another one and then another one taking over. Everybody agrees. And so because of that, it would actually be impossible to do a double spend attack with XRP against an exchange. And that's a massive difference between XRP and a proof of work coin. It's just not possible. No matter how much, you can't just go and buy hash power. There's nothing you could do that would convince the exchange to double spend, because the exchange is running its node with the software on that it trusts. So unless you can actually tamper with the software on that node run by the exchange, then you can't double spend. And if you could do that, then they've got bigger problems anyway, because you could go in and just monkey around with the database and change all the trades and the balances. So hopefully that's explained it. Hopefully that's explained what double spend attacks are, what happened with Ethereum Classic, why XRP is different, and why XRP is not vulnerable to this. And actually, this got reported quite a lot. There's a lot of reports here sort of saying, are proof of work blockchains still secure? And actually, Hodor from the XRP community has written a very good blog post. If you haven't already read it, I highly recommend it, talking about proof of work and talking about some other aspects of proof of work, as its scalability, its speed, its energy consumption. Now, there's another thing here as well, which is quite interesting. So, another kind of argument for proof of work being secure is that in order to run this kind of attack, you would actually destroy the value of the coin. You know, if you were able to successfully attack Bitcoin, you would destroy the value of Bitcoin because its reputation would be in tatters. So you would actually destroy the value of the coin that you are holding. And that's the argument put forward. This chap here, Ivan here. If I just play this bit here.
And this is of course devastating for the network. And if I do any of these things, for example, if I double spend, you can imagine what would happen to the Bitcoin price. As soon as we have this double spending attack, someone that is able to execute a double spending attack, the whole network is worthless. Bitcoin is worthless. And the same is with if I'm able to block transactions from one address going to another address, if I'm able to block specific addresses, that would also make the network useless, because, I mean, the whole idea is that anyone should be able to use Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and now we have this censorship going on. So we have to keep in mind that whatever I do, I would crash the price of Bitcoin.
So that's his argument there, and it's a common argument, and it makes a lot of sense that if you were to do something that damaged the price of Bitcoin, then you would only be harming yourself if you held it. So great. So when Ethereum Classic was attacked, the price dropped, right? Well, no. Oh, God, come on. 1 second here. There we go. Oh, it's forcing me to. But anyway, you can probably see behind here. I've got the charts here. Blue is Ethereum Classic versus US dollars. Green is XRP, and orange is Bitcoin. You can see they move actually fairly regularly. And the 5th, which is about here, was where that event happened. It was reported a few days later. Ethereum Classic went down a bit, but it still followed. I mean, so did everything else anyway. You know, they've all followed the same the same thing here. I don't have my details here to log in, so I can't scroll along here. But actually, if you scroll along further and see that actually, no, the price hasn't dropped in Ethereum Classic. It's really strange in that it didn't kill the price. You would have thought that having had that attack that it would have destroyed the price. Now, there's various theories as to why that didn't happen. A lot of people say that Ethereum Classic is mainly owned by a couple of very wealthy individuals that run funds and exchanges, and that exchanges only really listed it for their own benefit, and there's a lot of manipulation going on behind the scenes, and that's why it's happened that way. But yeah, maybe the economics are changing. Maybe it's no longer such a financial deterrent not to attack. It was kind of like aviation security. And terrorist attacks on planes. All of the defense was based upon the assumption that a hijacker of a plane would want to live. They wouldn't want to kill themselves in the process of hijacking a plane. And as soon as that model changed, from sort of 9/11 onwards, as soon as it became a case that terrorists didn't necessarily want to survive an attack, the entire security model had to change, because all the assumptions that had been made were no longer valid, and so they had to change them all, because the ground rules, effectively the assumptions had changed. Now, if it's the same with proof of work, that actually you can attack a cryptocurrency and it doesn't cost a huge amount of money, or it doesn't cause a financial detriment to yourself, then it may not, the assumptions you make about the security might no longer be valid. What else here? Oh yeah, and just to mention, big up one. There's a Singaporean exchange called Bitrue that did a fantastic job here about being very open with it, and they detected the 51% attack. The attacker tried to withdraw 13,000 Ethereum ETC from their platform, but got halted. So their system managed to detect it, and managed to stop the attack, because of course you're trying to double spend against an exchange. If an exchange can spot that and prevent you from doing anything further, so typically what you would do is you would trade that cryptocurrency for another unrelated cryptocurrency and then withdraw that, and then maybe withdraw it to another exchange and change it, and then another exchange, and kind of hop on along, such that your trail becomes hard to follow. I guess Bitrue managed to spot it before somebody can actually do anything with it, and cancel any effect, which is great of them. So that's it. Any questions? Anybody got any questions here? Oh yeah, Tom Kustner asked about proof of stake versus proof of work versus the consensus protocol and XRP. So proof of work, you have to do a certain amount of CPU power. You have to burn electricity to kind of prove you're the you are the person to go forward with it. Proof of stake is to do with how much you own. So proof of stake, you have to basically put up collateral, and by putting that collateral up, you effectively only a certain number of people can do that. So if you can put that collateral up because you have that, then that reduces the number of people that can actually choose which transactions go forward. I'm simplifying that a bit, but yeah, it rather than based upon how much computing power you got, how much CPU power, mining power you've got, proof of stake works on how much of collateral you've got. And there's other systems as well that people have tried. There's things like proof of storage, which is basically how much disk space you've got, and things like that. Some cryptocurrencies like Dash use a hybrid. They use both proof of work and proof of stake. Now Dash is also potentially vulnerable to a 51% attack at the moment. There's one particular mining pool that has about 52% of the hash power. I'm not sure if they can practically do it because of the proof of stake element as well that's combined in there. I know they're working on a system called chain locks that should prevent somebody going away, producing a much longer chain, and then suddenly appearing again. Basically, there's sort of these checkpoints that validate it, and a few other currencies coming up with something similar. But yeah, that's kind of how proof of stake works. Any other questions here? Anybody else? Hopefully I've covered everything. Okay. So W. Bowman's asked, proof of stake so the rich can still cheat it, fail. Well, it's not so much they can cheat it. There's intricacies there I've glossed over, some of which I will confess I don't understand fully. It's not so much the rich can cheat it. It's a case of you're trying to select a limited number of people to make a decision, and by doing it based upon stake, that's how you do it. And I think there's punishments built into the algorithms for, if you do cause trouble, effectively your collateral is you've put up. So if you cause trouble, then I think fines can be taken out of your collateral. That means you have to basically be good, otherwise it can be taken out there. Anything else? Hopefully that's everything. Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and going to try and continue the show going forward each week again now. And so if anybody has any topics they want me to cover, otherwise I might go back and start recovering some of the older topics again. Again, part of the idea for this series is to just help people explain some of the technical aspects, understand some of the technical aspects themselves. So I'm more than happy to go back and recover some of the bits and pieces. Sometimes you don't get it the first time, and after a few times, or explain slightly differently, these things start to become easier to understand. So, I'll be going through. So hopefully I'll be back again this time next week, next Monday. And thank you very much. And any comments, leave them in the comments here, or grab me on Twitter at Hamato. And do all the likey, subscribey, YouTubey stuff that being a YouTuber I've got to beg you for now. And great. See you next week. Thanks a lot.